Η κυρία Ζεϊνέπ Τουρκγιλμάζ πήρε διδακτορικό από το τμήμα Ιστορίας του Πανεπιστημίου της Καλιφόρνιας στο Λος Άντζελες. Η διατριβή της με τίτλο «Η διαταραχή του προσιλητισμού» βασίστηκε σε έρευνες που έκανε στα Οθωμανικά, Βρετανικά και Αμερικανικά αρχεία ιεραποστολών. Περιέγραψε σε αυτήν και τους κρυπτοχριστιανούς του Πόντου. Συμμετείχε στο μεταδικτατορικά του Ιδρύματος Άντρου Μέλλον από το 2009 ως το 2010. Όσο επίσης και στα εκπαιδευτικά η Ευρώπη στη Μέση Ανατολή, η Μέση Ανατολή στην Ευρώπη. Στο Wissenschaft College του Βερολίνου από το 2010 ως το 2011. Εργάστηκε στο Dartmouth College ως εθνικός καθηγήτρια της ιστορίας από το 2011 ως 2016. Σήμερα απασχολείται ως συνεργάτης ερευνήτρια στο Διαπεριφερειακό Φόρουμ Μελετών του Βερολίνου. Εργάζεται σε δύο αντικείμενα. Πρώτον, τους κούλους του Γένζη από την Οθωμανική Αυτοκρατορία, Γενζίντι, από την Οθωμανική Αυτοκρατορία μέχρι τη δημιουργία του εθνικού κράτους. Και το δεύτερο για το ζήτημα των ποντίων από το 1916 και μετά. Η έρευνά της και το διδακτικό αντικείμενο περιλαμβάνει τη δημιουργία κρατών, τα φυλετικά θέματα, τον εθνικισμό, την απεικιοκρατία και τις θρησκευτικές κοινότητες, επικεντρώνοντας στην ετεροδοξία και τις δράσεις των Αποστολών στη Μέση Ανατολή από το 1800 έως σήμερα. Μα προχθές φάγανε ένα Ιεραπόστολο κάπου, έτσι. Κάπου διάβασα ότι φάγανε ένα Ιεραπόστολο κάπου εκεί. Σήμερα θα μας μιλήσει με το θέμα στα αγγλικά, γι' αυτό όσοι δεν μπορείτε να πάρετε αυτό το μηχάνημα για δυσμηνία, όταν η καταστροφή και η δυστυχία γίνεται αχώριστος συντροφός τους.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak here. I'm actually going to talk for the first time on this new subject. Previously I was working on non-Orthodox communities, meaning religiously non-conforming communities of the Ottoman Empire, and crypto-Christians of Pontus was one of those communities, and this is how I got into the issue of Pontus at the first place. And then with the story of crypto-Christians, I grew a fascination with the dynamics of life in Pontus. And most recently, I decided to study the collapse of the coexistence model in Pontus. And here I am. And when the invitation came, I decided that it's a good opportunity to do the first round. So if I go a little too long, please stop me. Since it's a new project, I can't always control the time. So a cipher telegram marked as extremely confidential and personal, and addressed to the Minister of Interior, Talat Pasha, sent on May 11th, 1916, from Giresun conveyed the following message. You'll see a lot of these documents, because I thought it would be nice to show some of those from the Ottoman archives. Okay, I quote the telegram. When one considers, due to the abundance of Greeks along the coast, necessity of their transfer to the interior areas in a manner unlike the transfer of Armenians, this brings to the mind the strong possibility that a significant number of our troops would be occupied with business. Yet, I propose, for instance, if at first all of the Greeks that are within the 20 kilometers range of the battle line could withdraw to the interior of the coastal areas they desired, within the time limit we assigned, and after this, gradually, this area could be expanded to 30, 40, 50 and 60 kilometers, then complaints, desertion and brigandage would not take place. And thereby, I doubt that civil and military administration would have to occupy with these too much. Implementation of this plan should start with Vakfı Kebir and Görele, and then should continue in the following order to Trebolu, Trepolis, Giresun, Kerasunda, and perhaps Ordu, Kotyora, towns and thus relatively cleansing tahtir, these of the residents' Greek population. When disaster, flight, and calamity of misery becomes their inseparable companion, the misery captivating them would reduce the brigandage and animosity they dare, as well as their wealth, to desirable level, and would secure that the rest remaining in the coastal areas would get the hell out of our sacred patria, Vatan-ı Mukaddes. The lines belongs to Cemal Azmi, the Governor-General of Trabzon, also known as the Butcher of Trabzon, having not only ordered some of most cruel forms of torture and extermination against Armenians, but also zealously took part in the massacres in person only a year ago. Cemal Azmi wrote this telegram when he was in Ordu, where he sought refuge after handing the city of Trabzon to Hrisantos, the Archbishop of Trabzon, on April 16, 1916, after it became clear to him that the Ottoman forces would not be able to stand against the Russian army's occupation. In Ordu, he continued to govern what was left out of his province until February 1918, and communicated with the military and political officers on the burning questions of the empire, as well as the mundane affairs of everyday life. Right after the armistice of Mudros, he fled on a German torpedo boat to Berlin, where he was assassinated, and you see the photo on the right-hand side. Against such horrendous records, when it comes to Pontic Greeks, Cemal Azmi is ironically often remembered for the amiable letter he addressed to Metropolitan Chrysanthos before surrendering Trabzon, where he allegedly said, in a submissive tone, I quote, "We took this city from the Greeks, and now we are returning it to them," end of quote. Yet, I argue, he was one of the now forgotten masterminds of the Pontic displacement and genocide. While in exile during the Russian occupation, he wrote numerous reports to the capital and exchanged telegrams with Talat Pasha and Vahid Pasha, commander of the Third Army stationed in eastern provinces, voicing a hawkish position on how to handle the Greek question in the unoccupied territories. In this particular telegram quoted above, he not only insisted that Greeks should be subjected to compulsory transfer, but he also detailed how to carry out those transfers. I'm not going to go into the details of discussion, but one of the things that I noticed when I started working on this period is there is so much emphasis on what came after 1918, 1919. So pretty much the emphasis is between 1919 and 1923, 24, depending on which date you want to focus. I mean, what happened in 1916 and 1917 is left out. So this, in a way, I think is quite problematic because it really prevents us from understanding the unique dynamics that not only preceded the transfers, but how it was carried out after 1916, 1917. I propose that reading this telegram as one of the testaments to the political authorities' intention for ethnic cleansing targeting Greeks of Pontus. Given Cemal Azmi's record and the ongoing extermination of Armenians, solely this proposal for another transfer would have sufficed to claim premeditation, especially with the choice of wordings such as cleansing, catastrophe, misery, getting the hell out of our homeland. Yet, particularly because of what follow, wherein plans and implementations, imaginations and realities turn out to be in compliance, makes this telegram a precursor and a smoking gun of the resolution provided by the Ottoman government to what they saw as the Greek question during World War I. Following this, and many other classified and ciphered telegrams that involve local governors as well as prominent political and military actors of the time, such as Minister of Interior Talat Pasha, Commander-in-Chief of 3rd Army, Vehip Pasha, and obviously Minister of War and the person in charge, Enver Pasha. Out of these correspondences, they formulated a number of policies which turned Pontus from a site of exception, as eloquently argued by famous historian Antony Breyer, to one of catastrophe, resulting in mass-scale exterminations, uprooting of an autochthon group from their millennia-old homeland, and finally, annihilation of coexistence, even before the population exchange of 1923-24. Okay. So, why I think Pontic case is interesting. Often, in studying Pontic genocide, it's used a comparative method which not necessarily fully comparative in perspective. It's mostly taking Armenian genocide as the model and trying to see if what happened in Pontus matches what happened in Armenians and does prove whether what is experienced is genocide or not. I try to take Pontus question to the forefront, to the center, and say actually, if you look very closely Pontic question, not only we are going to understand better how people lived together in Ottoman Empire for centuries, and how drastic and sudden and destructive the collapse of the empire and destruction of these communities were. So there are certain things I think we have to be careful with. For example, Armenians obviously experienced a long period of violent episodes before the final extermination in 1915, right? Most widely known as 1894-1896 massacres, pogroms. Pontic Greeks didn't have any of those record of pogroms before 1916. Therefore, collapse of coexistence in Pontus came more abruptly and unforeseeably. And in studying Armenian genocide, the responsibility is often rested on the war, dissolution of the empire, or Committee of Union and Progress, which overall blurs the responsibility and reproduces the Kemalist thesis about being, Turkey being a radical break from the Ottoman past. Yet in the Pontic case, I insist, these systematic exiles were planned and carried out by the army and the bureaucracy of both political entities. First by the 3rd Army of the Ottoman Empire, and then by the Central Army Command of the Turkish state in the making. These consecutive and mutually enforcing deportations raise important questions about the decision-making processes, responsibility, especially much disputed continuity between these political entities, as well as resistance to them. So how does people in Turkey, especially scholars in Turkey, talk about what happened during World War I, from 1916 onwards? Drawing on memoirs of Vasil Usta, a Greek revolutionary from Samsun, Stefanos Gerosimos, a famous historian, at least in Turkey, late Stefanos Gerosimos, argued that first series of deportations began from Trebolu, a town bordering Russian invasion, after the Usta's premeditated and provocative actions earlier in September. According to Gerosimos, Usta and his 80 men had raided into Muslim villages, and also in the company of Lazaros Melidis, secretary to the Greek Council in Samsun, in order to punish those who were known to maltreat Greeks and Christians. Yet in reality, he claimed, these attacks aimed to provoke Turks to reciprocate in order to force Russians to intervene on their behalf without further delay. He concluded that a Russian intervention didn't materialize, but due to these attacks, Istanbul government decided to population transfer, and initial attacks of the Turkish gangs began also in response. Right? This is the narrative he claimed. And here, these are all books and pieces written by Turkish scholars working on the Pontus questions, exclusively on the Pontus questions, and they all emphasize the use of documents from the Ottoman and General Staff archives, and quite interestingly, they don't really talk about 1916, 1917, using the Ottoman documents, but they reference Gerasimos's article and how he brought in Vasil Usta's attack on the Muslim populations. So what I did, unfortunately, I'm not as lucky as these people. I don't have access to General Staff's archives, but I have access to the Ottoman archives. So I decided to look really why these people who are really obsessed with providing documents for every single item doesn't really use any Ottoman documents for 1916 and 17 and instead used Greek sources. And quite interestingly, it turns out that Vasil Usta's attack was not really recorded, seen significant enough to be recorded in the Ottoman archives. So far I haven't been able to locate it. Secondly, which is actually, I think, more problematic and probably tells us more about why these authors are using Gerasimos' article rather than the Ottoman sources, because those sources actually show that both the discussions and the first waves of population transfers predates the first attack claimed by Gerasimos. So the first transfer started in March, whereas according to Gerasimos, Vasil Usta's attack was in September, and the decision to carry out transfer was taken in October, and then the first transfers began in November. So it is historically, factually wrong. Although these authors, especially the first one, knows it very well because he had access even to military tribunals and he was a scholar at General Staff's academy, so he had access to whatever, every archival document possible on the Pontic issue, but he continued to adhere to Gerasimos's thesis because, I mean, coming from a Greek scholar, well-known in Turkey, I guess it's sounded a good, authentic voice supporting, in their mind, the nihilist relative. I mean, Gerasimos is far away from being denialist, but quite unfortunately, his argument faded into, was taken over by the denialist narrative. So, after realizing that there is actually no case based on Vasil Usta, I tried to see what was going on in 1916 and 17, and I looked into documents that were produced by Cemal Azmi, Talat Pasha, Enver Pasha, whatever I can find at the Ministry of Interior and War Office that I could have access at the Ottoman archives. Quite interestingly, Cemal Azmi, among all these men, known to have taken really atrocious decisions to exterminate different groups, Cemal Azmi was the one who insisted on the transfer of Pontic Greeks from very early and consistently, and more hawkishly from any other group. And at the time, unlike what is argued by Turkish scholars now, at the time, the basis for transfer, even for Cemal Azmi, was not the Greek gangs activity. It was the possibility of espionage and the presence of fugitives that can use the coastal areas to escape the empire, to Russian Empire. So basically the entire paradigm at that time, the Pontic Greeks constituted, on the coastline, constituted a strategic, a military question, a possibility that hasn't materialized yet, but could be materialized if not prevented. So, what Professor Hoffman mentioned, Savitis mentioned earlier in her presentation, this was taken as a preventive method that actually responded to a crime. So even in 1918, when the new governor of Trabzon was asked about the Pontic Greeks' activities during the war, I mean gang activities, gang-related activities. The single case he could cite was, you know, an ex-soldier from Rize being tortured and killed by, killed and tortured in a Greek village. And again, the culprits are not known, whether the residents of the village or not, but clearly Cemal Azmi, even in that case, when the Greek residents refused to collaborate and tell him who the culprits are, and I don't know if the residents of the village were aware of or knew who the culprits are, but when they refused to cooperate, Cemal Azmi single-handedly decided to expel the entire village, not just the men, not just those who were politically active. The entire village included women and children from their villages to the interior. For Cemal Azmi, the issue was emotional. He really meant in his, like in his telegram, he really looked for, wanted to pursue emotional and cultural destruction of this community. He targeted a specific collective, ignoring the law binding between, let's say, crime, offender, and punishment, right? So, given that these discussions was taking place only a year after the notorious decision to deport Armenians, which was still ongoing with horrific scenes as these correspondences traveled back and forth, each actor was of course aware of the implications of proposing another deportation reflected on their opinion notes. So Cemal Azmi also cautioned against the Armenian precedent as a negative case, but not for the human cost. He underscored in his telegram that Ottoman soldiers should not be overburdened with these transfers. So transfers should be arranged in a way that you know, the populations could be moved out of, these Greek populations could be moved out of coastal areas without causing much trouble to the Ottoman bureaucrats or the army. On May 1st, 1916, again, long before Vasil Usta, Cemal Azmi sent another telegram stating that the Third Army, Vehip Bey, is on board with the transfer, or to be precise, deportation. He uses, you know, the term deportation, and asked if it is viable or appropriate in terms of the dynamics of international politics. One should note that Vehip Pasha and Cemal Bey were not on very good terms, and actually Cemal Azmi Bey was almost removed from his post due to complaints of the local Greeks of abuse. Azmi claimed at that point that Vehbi Pasha was behind this scenario and in return accused of having improper relations and vested interest with the local Greeks. So each side is accusing each other with some connection to the Greeks. But this international politics, paying attention to international politics, was particularly interesting at this time because actually once after the initial decision to transfer and transport Pontic Greeks from the coastal area, I'm talking about Western Pontus of course, it was suspended. And the suspension order actually came from Talat Pasha, who's notorious, right? I mean, he's one of the triumvirate who had decided on the fate of Armenians only a year ago. And he's, among all these men, was the most calculative and cautious one, even reluctant to transfer the Greek Pontics. Talat Pasha's rather short but numerous telegrams asking opinions of Vehip Pasha and Cemal Azmi, as well as local governors, either on the transfer question or its logistics, always explicitly explicitly said, you know, we should watch out for Greece, right? Greece is neutral, we should wait, and if we do the transfers now, this can provoke Greeks to enter the war. So the decision to transfer the Pontic Greeks waited. I mean, he was on the side to wait until Greece entered the war. On the ground, this didn't materialize. Local, Cemal Azmi and some other local officials were very eager to do that. But if you look these two documents, this is Talat Bey's signature on the left, and that comes from Enver Pasha. This one actually confirms the decision to, and this is 1917, early 1917. He agreed to the transfer of coastal Greeks to the interior, at least 30 kilometers, preferably 50 kilometers. And the second actually order comes from Enver Pasha much later, after Greece decided to join the war. And it's a very detailed list of who should be deported when. And Pontic Greeks is also in that list, and that also drives traces the route. Since I don't have much time left, I'll just briefly go over. Okay. So how could you transfer such a huge group, right? Such a huge community, and it's very well-grounded community. Orders sent by Azmi mid-July 1960, before the mass transfers began, were as follows. Greeks should be protected from the abuses of mischievous and immoral officers. Each district will complete the transfer of their Greek inhabitants in 1 week. Transfer will begin from areas closer to the war zone, and orders for transfer will not be sent out before the completion of orders in one district. So he didn't want, for example, order to know that the Greeks order to know that the orders are in the way. So it would remain as, let's say, just a measure that is targeting travel, right? So he was very cautious about that. Greeks should be free to sell or keep their property or give it under someone else's control. Here the contrast is to that of Armenian deportations, which enable the confiscation of their property as abandoned property, right? Embodiment, right? So they are underlining this measure. Transfers will begin with Trabzon and continue with Canik. Since Alucra, Karahisar, and Suşehri are not appropriate to receive these populations, Greeks of Ordu and Gresens should be sent to Mesudiye, Kolisar, and Niksar. And unlike Enver Pasha's transfer, order which specifically says it should be men between the age of 15 and 50, here Azmi mentions that women can also be included in these transfers, and they did. But how did the local officers receive this order? What did they make of these orders? Here comes an example from the governor of Canik district, which is to the west of Pontus, and it was to the west of Trabzon, so kind of its own administration. I find this quite interesting and quite a testimony to how local officers perceived the tacit assumptions when these orders for transfers came. I quote, "Not only it would not be possible to find vehicles to transport 200,000 Greek residents to the interior, military and existing police do not have the capacity to deal with it." Right? This is the beginning of the telegram. In the rest, he says, I quote, "In fact, dispersing the Greeks who has the population majority in the district by this means and replacing them with Muslim element would be beneficial and advantageous from the perspective of country's future." Actually, when it comes to the Armenian genocide, these kind of documents comes after the deportations begin, not before the deportations. So in that respect, the premeditation, the intent to destroy and destruct is more clearly visible in the Pontic case than the Armenian case. Beforehand, right? So, what were some of the implementations, right? So they targeted the wealthy, just like Cemal Azmi mentioned, accumulation of wealth. So wealthy and prominent figures. There are several telegrams and petitions in the Ottoman archives coming from the exiles. Particularly Georgi Stephanopoulos from Giresun'da sent several asking to be transferred to a different place of exile. He was very unhappy. I think he was somewhere in Çorum. He was devastated, but his case was repeatedly refused. Another one comes from Papas Todorik and Anesti in name of a certain number of people. And in their case, it was after the end of the order, so towards the end of the war, but they were still kept in the their exile areas, and they didn't let them to return. This one is very interesting, but the half of the document survived, the rest doesn't exist. It comes from merchant apostle of Bafra, as you see, educated people and rich people. He says specifically, I'm a law-abiding citizen of the Ottoman Empire. I've been your Highness's slave. I'm very sad to see that you put me in the same role with the Palikaria. And he uses the expression Palikaria. So he was very uncomfortable that he was thought to be one of those, rogue Pontic guys. And he was like, I'm a rich merchant. I have no business here. The property issue was particularly interesting because, unlike what was claimed in the orders, there were attacks on of course, the exiles, and then the properties were confiscated and taken. I'll finish. So let me actually, in conclusion, just let me read one more document. I know I read too many. In the long run, of course, 1916 and 17 were not as high cost as what happened from 1921 to 1922 particularly. But as historians, we shouldn't really compare the human suffering, right? We shouldn't really measure the human suffering. So intended achievements of first wave of deportations remained relatively shaky, right? But for the lack of a better term, but this cannot hide the fact that they planned and partially carried out with an intent to punish, destroy, and eliminate. Furthermore, they also created fault lines in these areas and redefined the conditions of coexistence. Only after these deportations we hear the existence of Greek gangs attacking on Muslim populations. And actually yet another governor who dared to oppose the orders. He said basically, I don't agree with your decision to transfer. He said specifically, first, we could not protect the transfers, they were attacked. Second, their property is confiscated, we can't stop that either. But third, it's creating gangs among the Greeks, and I'm using the official language, of course, here. And he specifically says that villages around Bafra, women, children, and men took the mountains after these transfers, so we shouldn't really do that. Let me end here, and thank you very much for giving me extra time and having me here.